Beowulf's Writing Club podcast. For talkers by listeners.
This is
Whoops.
this is episode 3, and I'm Cray Pennison.
I'm Leviticus.
Shane Strander.
Jack Manifold.
Christopher Gement.
Okay, so topic 1, just jump right into it. We're going to be talking about the voice of a writer that every writer takes on whenever he or she writes, and you'll recognize it when you read it because a lot of writers have really distinct voices, but many people probably don't know, what is a voice or what constitutes it. So I'll just quickly explain that what makes up a writer's voice is kind of what that writer uses, and like even as specific as words, like what words that writer uses often and how often she uses those words, how the words are used, and just the overall diction of the writer, the way they phrase certain sentences and transitions and things like that.
The voice is a very natural thing that usually comes upon writers as they write a lot. Like, you don't go into writing with a voice. You usually have to be spending a lot of time, and also a big thing that you can do is mimicry at first, where you go ahead and look at other people's voices and try to, I guess, develop your own based off of that.
The one thing, though, that a lot of people will do because they don't realize they have a natural voice when they write, because you will have a voice if you're a writer, no matter what. Just don't. Just don't try to force it.
Do any of y'all have any authors that y'all get your voice from or inspired?
Let's see. Well, since I'm a horror writer, I usually get a lot of my, I guess, creepy sequences from Edgar Allan Poe, in all honesty.
Pretty well known for horror stories.
Well, no, it's just also his tone whenever his characters, I guess, descend in, madness. It's kind of a, like you can feel how he kind of, slowly gets madder and madder, and the way he writes his sentences, and, you can kind of, like, as you're reading it, you can feel it without directly saying it. Like the old saying, show, don't tell.
Same here, kind of, specifically with Edgar Allan Poe, is that I've read a lot of his writings and really enjoy it, and I like to write horror, so I haven't been conscious of my voice or trying to analyze it until recently when I actually discovered that writers had specific voices, but I think subconsciously I probably do, in some ways, be it subtle or not, mimic certain authors like Edgar Allan Poe, especially H.P. Lovecraft for the horror aspect. And Shane, do you?
Well, I haven't done a lot of writing so far, so I really don't know my voice. But I'm gonna be doing some writing really soon, and I'm gonna try not to really look at my voice and just see what comes out, see what happens.
That's actually a very good thing to do,
Yeah.
because if you try to focus too much on your voice, you're not going to be able to get anything else done.
Mm-hmm.
And a voice is something that you yourself can't necessarily look at first, but rather you need a second person to read it and pick out a voice for you, because sometimes your voice works, and if you try to do a certain voice, it might turn out, catastrophically.
So I'm just going to see what happens when I start writing a lot.
What about you, Jack?
I really don't know what kind of voice I write. I don't like him. I don't really write a lot. But when I do write, it's just like kind of like a normal conversation, I guess.
Well, what kind of genre do you write?
I don't really know what kind of genre. Kind of like actiony, I guess.
Like thriller?
Definitely
Adventure?
more adventure, yeah.
Alright.
See, that's one of the problems I'm having, is that I read a lot of science fiction and I want to start writing science fiction. I don't know if there's really a definite voice. Like in a horror story, there's definitely a voice that you could follow. Would y'all say there's something to follow in a horror story? A science fiction?
What type of voice would there be in a science fiction? Because
I think that depends on the nature of it.
Yeah.
It could be something very futuristic and almost ridiculous seeming with like technology or, not post-apocalyptic, but sort of apocalyptic future. Whereas you probably would have a totally different tone of voice when you read like a dystopian universe science fiction type of story.
yeah, definitely. In other terms of, I guess, science fiction is that it usually ranges because in horror too, there's not just the classical, like there's not this one style of writing voice in terms of horror. There's also kind of like the really like, slasher flick, gory kind of horror where you just, dive right into all the stuff that's happening as opposed to like Edgar Allan Poe's kind of writing style, which is like his descent into madness.
So I suppose what we could do right now is just go around and kind of discuss an author that we really like or think has a very distinctive voice that you may, even if you weren't reading it with the intention of picking out or analyzing that author's voice, you might have just noticed certain little like quirks or things that's very specific to that author. So if you would like to start us out, Shane, if you have anything to add.
All right. Well, I really don't. I'm reading a science fiction teenager book. I was a series of them. I'm number 4, and then the series after them. Really good book, and I really don't know the voice. It's in first person, and the style it switches in between characters. A lot like each chapter will be a different character in the story. So each character almost has a different voice to themselves, to their personality. So it's really hard to say what type of voice you can pick up from a book like that, since it's pretty, I don't say bland, but it's not extreme, and there's a couple different ones in the book.
Actually, that's pretty important right there, the fact that the author doesn't just have the same voice for different characters. Because what we're talking about now is the writer's voice, not necessarily the character's voice. But if you do a story like that where it's kind of more character-based, and to where you have, like you said, like a first-person point of view, you're going to want to be able to capture the voice of the character so they're able to tell their own story. Percy Jackson, that series is very well for it, because especially in the beginning, it very much sounds like it's, this kid, Percy Jackson, a 12-year-old, speaking to you and, telling you this story, as opposed to Rick Riordan, who's the author, in him almost like telling you the story of this kid. He really sort of captures the voice of that kid. And then later on, you really are able to, almost point out his voice in terms of, I guess, who's talking. But let's get away from character's voice and back to author's voice.
One author that I think has a very unique voice that you pick up a lot on, and of course this does have to do with the way the author writes dialogue and the character's voice, but even just in general is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle of the very, very famous Sherlock Holmes stories, which I've been reading an immense amount of lately. And just the way well, I know you said we were going to get back to an author's voice, but the way that he specifically represents the dialogue and like the voice of the characters in that dialogue is very unique to his style. As with certain phrases, like, he'll say, "Oh, let's throw some light upon the matter," when Holmes is speaking to Watson, and also he'll use the characters to his advantage in very like choppy dialogue on purpose, of like being very back and forth with no adjectives in between, but that works in great effect to the story's style and the style of the character.
All right, I think another thing that we should mention upon this is that voice also, I believe, affects, I guess, the tone of the story in a way, where if the author and his voice is more like a creepy kind of, style, the story itself is going to be more creepy. The mood and the atmosphere of the story is going to be more creepy and dark and, more depressing demeanor, as opposed to a comedian or a comedic voice,
Right.
where it's going to be a lot more happy, uplifting, and it's going to be funny because that's what it's meant to be.
What about you, Chris? Do you have any specific book or author you're thinking
Well,
of?
I myself, I don't particularly write. Like I said in earlier podcasts, I help with other people's voice and try and make it heard. So
From that point of view, what have you seen a lot of, or have you ever noticed that you could recognize someone's specific writing style as opposed to others, or things that you picked up on that seem to be repetitive but in a good way, kind of?
not too much. Most of the people that I've helped have started writing and haven't really found their voice yet.
But compare one individual to another. Have you
Well,
seen?
I think what he's saying right now is kind of important to pick up on is the fact that since we're all really young and we're still, trying to kickstart into writing, that we don't necessarily have our own voices yet.
That's true. But I mean, even though it's not very developed or refined yet, we will still have a voice. Although some people, their voices might be forced in their writing, or it could be very, so to say, immature.
They can also change a lot with the more you read and the more you age and different vocabulary that you learn.
Oh, absolutely. And it will, most probably. Because the more someone writes and also the more they grow, and like you said, the more they read, their voice tends to develop and becomes more unique to their own style.
Chris, in terms of the story Aragon and that whole series, I know you're very familiar with it. The book series was like the first book, Aragon, was written by Christopher Paolini when he was very young.
15, I think.
No, he was. I think he was a little older than that.
Okay.
I might be mixing up years.
I think
but
maybe like 17, 18, something like that.
He finished college when he was 18 or 19, so he's a really smart person. But he I don't really know what to say about his voice. He was very consistent with how he wrote. You could kind of see what he was gonna say in a way to where it was a little bit cliche, but it was fun enough to make you want to keep reading.
So did it seem like he kind of, I guess, mirrored off of other people who you may have read, beforehand? How that kind of influenced him into writing this way?
Well, it was like he combined different kinds of lores and stories and made it his own new original kind of thing. So, in a way, he did reflect off of other people's stories, but he still kept it as his own one unique voice.
All right. So by combining many different, like the masters almost, he was able to create his own, although I assume when he wrote this, not perfectly, refined in terms of voice. But you could definitely see that he was, that there was a voice there. All right.
And there are certain things you can do when you go back and read over your writing, or when you're writing as well, to help develop your voice and refine it so that it's better. So, some of these things are obviously experimentation. Like, don't be afraid to, even if you think it's going to be dumb or just really bad in general, don't be afraid to kind of go out of the box or to try a different style and see if it suits you better or if you like it more in your writing. Just writing as yourself, like I said before, don't try to force it, let it go naturally, and then it's easier to more look at your voice, I think, when you read back at your own writing and think to yourself, like, is that how I talk? And if it's not, that's okay, because once again, your writing voice will not be the same as your speaking voice, almost definitely. And you kind of picture what, like, readers you want to appeal to, or who you think you would want to read your story the most, and what they would want, or what you imagine, how you imagine they would read it.
Well, let's talk about that for a moment. We're gonna kind of do like a little experimentational thing here in terms of I guess we're gonna say a genre, and we might want to discuss about what type of, I guess, voice you would want.
Alright, welcome back. We had a little technical difficulties, and we're going to start off by talking about...
The eye of the storm has passed.
That wasn't recorded before. Anyway, we're going to start off by talking about character voice.
Recorded.
I wasn't. Who wants to start off on character voice?
Well, I guess I will with like books.
Running away or something?
Get closer to the
Y'all
mic,
can't
please.
see it, but he just kind of like leaned about 5 feet back from the mic.
Flee.
And by lean, he sprinted in the other direction until we yanked on the tightrope tied to his ankle.
Like
Now talk!
Yeah, but like, it's not just the author's voice in the story, it's also the character's voice. Like, for example, Percy Jackson, character Percy has a very blunt voice, while like, for Annabeth, it's like kind of sophisticated in a sense.
Hermione Granger.
We're done with cliches.
That again?
Cliche character joke, but go on.
Just go on.
You got it.
Somebody go.
All right. Well, I'll go then. Especially in terms of that, the way you put that is that in terms of character voice, it's not just this character uses big words. This character has some weird dialect accent by putting like little apostrophes and not pronouncing T's. It goes into a lot more stuff like that in terms of not only how they speak but also what they say. Like, you wouldn't put some sort of smart character saying something extremely stupid unless it's, to show the contradiction, to prove a point.
Or if he had a stroke.
Or if he had a stroke.
Okay.
That just went dark.
Well, I kind of brought it up before.
PG.
I kind of brought it up before we made the cut. Is about item number 4 in the rest of the series. About how Pittacus lore changes between. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. Brings up multiple characters. Each chapter is a different character, and therefore they're all going to have different voices because they're all from different countries, lands. Well, all right, they lived in different countries, and male, female, saw intelligence. Not to be mean, but stupid. I mean,
That's fine.
they all have different voices, so I think that's one thing that if you want to... I haven't seen that type of writing before where each chapter is a different character. I know it's out there, I just haven't seen it before.
George R.R. Martin does that.
Yeah, and Rick Riordan in the Heroes of Olympus series.
Oh, yeah, he does that too.
I haven't got to read that one yet. I want to, though. So
Spoilers.
That's something you got to keep in mind, is always be prepared to have multiple voices. Like, make sure that you yourself don't stick to one voice and it kind of ruins multiple characters.
Well, even if you're going into like a third-person point of view where there is no character's voice that you're getting into in terms of first person, but more so like just the dialogue is also really important, because you can develop the voices of the characters so much that it gets to a point where they're having a conversation when you might not necessarily need to say who says what. It'll just be talking, and then you'll start to understand and let it flow. Now, that could be an issue sometimes too, like in like the Ender Game series, like Chris mentioned earlier.
Well, recently, I've been reading a lot of the Ender Game stuff, and the way Orson Scott Card will have really long monologues, and then in the middle of that monologue, he'll say something. He'll have another character say something randomly without a he said or she said, and it really throws you off and kind of takes you out of the immersion. So you want to try and stay away from that.
Well, one thing that I noticed that maybe it's just me that it bothers me only, but when I'm reading a dialogue between two characters, and even when it's like a one-word sentence or a line that the character says, it's like so and so said this, so and so said this, so and so said this. It gets very repetitive. But like Chris was just saying, if you don't say who said the line and you don't have a distinct voice for every character, you're going to get confused. So having a distinct voice for every character is very important if you don't want to use repetition a lot on stating who said a line in a dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, that has to be balanced, obviously, or else it's either, it's too choppy, or like Chris said, you get lost and you don't know where you are, who's saying what. But also, as I said earlier, especially with like Sherlock Holmes, it can play into the style of that character and his or her personality, like the way it's written. Because, like I mentioned, in Sherlock Holmes, there will be points in the story where Sherlock is talking to one of his clients for a case, and it just goes back and forth with like 1 to 2 word sentences for almost a whole paragraph, because that's just his style of like quick, methodical manner of gaining facts and kind of moving the conversation along, not dwelling on stories. But it has to be smoothed out, and it's also really good to not do that if the character is not part of the character style, because you need to. What I'm trying to say is it's better to have a lot of description in between dialogue to kind of make it more interesting and easier to read.
Well, we can certainly go into dialogue later in like a later podcast, but at the moment we can focus more on character voices, especially in terms of the difference between, I guess, a child and an adult, because that can be really huge. Because sometimes you don't want a child to sound like an adult, nor do you want an adult to sound like a child unless it's done on purpose. Now, the way Orson Scott Card writes his children is actually, he writes them a lot smarter than they really are, but I guess it's kind of to show the intelligence level of them. So you don't, I just read a story from a friend recently where he had this old man who would be talking in dialogue, and his voice, I would get really encaptured into it. I could visualize this old man speaking to me. But then whenever he switched to his teenage girl character, she would still maintain the voice of the old man. So it would constantly throw me out into where, I can't give an example from it right now, but immediately throw me out. I would try to get through that, and then I would get, sucked back in by the old man's dialogue. So you definitely have to make sure that the voice of the character matches who they are in terms of ethnic. I can't pronounce that word. Nationality. Nationality. Is that the word?
Ethnicity.
Ethnicity.
You're a writer, man.
Hey,
I'm not a public speaker.
he knows how to write it down. That's what I'm saying.
All right.
Age, gender, all those things factor into what kind of voice you want. Of course, in order to make it kind of like a contradiction or to make a point, you could flip-flop them.
Well, one little last thing about voice, we kind of mentioned it earlier, but we never really worked on it or talked about it, is the diction that you use. If some people hate it when you use a bunch of big, long words, and other people say, I felt like I was reading a book made for a 5-year-old. And it also depends on the age of your characters if you're doing a first-person book. You're not going to have a 4-year-old character using giant words, but then to show the intelligence of people, you may want to use larger words.
Right.
But
it's not like a 4-year-old's going to be like, oh, his overall nature exasperated me.
Yeah. But that's a kind of question I want to bring up. Do y'all like reading larger words, or do y'all like to keep it like a normal day-to-day dialogue?
I don't think it's just larger words. I think it's more so the complexity of the words and the complexity of the sentences.
And,
When I
if there's a need for them, because once again, it's about balance. But if that could go into a character's voice. If the character's very intelligent or is known for using very big words, being like an English major or something, then use that. It's like you said with the 5-year-old, but on the other end.
That's just a tip to help you bring out a voice in the character.
Right. And once again, there has to be a balance in it.
Yeah, recording.
We can.
Yes,
we can
we are
try that.
recording person who randomly came through the door and that we're currently speaking to.
Somebody take it.
All right. Line! No. Okay.
Oh my God!
Okay, so we have reached the end of our podcast today. I hope you enjoyed listening. If not, well.
If not, I sympathize with you completely. Now,
We'll go ahead and, this is the end of our podcast. We'll go ahead and maybe go more in depth with this later, in a later podcast once we know more about it.
Not the next one, but later.
Of course not the next one, later on, way later
It's
on.
going to be a good one.
Yes, we have it planned out. And so this is the end of our podcast. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.